Before there was land, before there was sky, before there was anything we would recognize as the world, there was water. Not the kind of water you drink, not the kind that fills rivers or falls from clouds, but something far older and stranger. A primordial darkness made of water, pressing in from every direction, containing within it the seeds of everything that would ever exist. This is not a metaphor. This is not poetry written by someone who had never seen the sea. This is the literal cosmological belief of one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, the Sumerians and their Babylonian descendants, and it is written in clay. It survived 5,000 years. And what it describes, when you sit with it long enough, is genuinely difficult to explain away. The ancient Mesopotamians did not believe the sky was empty. They did not look up and see infinite space. What they saw, what they were absolutely certain of, was a solid dome arching over the flat disk of the earth. And above that dome, pressing down against it from every angle, an ocean. A real physical ocean full of divine water. And in that ocean, beings moved. Gods rested their thrones upon it. The sun god himself was depicted sitting on a celestial sea, floating above the very sky we live beneath. If that sounds strange to modern ears, consider this. The oldest written creation story ever discovered begins with those words. When above the heavens did not yet exist, when earth below had not yet come into being, there was only water. Two kinds of water mingled together in the dark, and from that mingling everything else followed. This is the opening of the Enuma Elish, inscribed across 7 clay tablets composed somewhere around 1750 BCE or perhaps earlier. And it describes the architecture of the universe with a precision that most people never hear about, because we tend to assume ancient people were simply guessing, simply telling stories to explain what they could not understand. But that dismissal deserves to be set aside for a moment, because what these tablets describe is internally consistent, geographically specific, and astonishingly detailed. The two primordial beings at the beginning of everything were called Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu was the freshwater ocean, specifically the ocean beneath the earth, the subterranean deep from which springs and rivers were believed to rise. Tiamat was the saltwater ocean, the surrounding sea, the chaotic immensity that pressed against the edges of the known world. These were not metaphors for water. These were understood to be literal, physical, cosmic oceans, beings of such scale and power that the gods themselves were born from the place where their waters touched and mingled. The first lines of the Enuma Elish describe this meeting. Their waters had mingled together before meadowland had coalesced, before reedbed was to be found, when not one of the gods had yet been formed. From that mingling came the first gods, Lahmu and Lahamu, then Anshar and Kishar, then Anu, the sky god, then Ea, also known as Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who would go on to become one of the most important figures in Sumerian mythology. The gods multiplied. They grew loud and restless, as the young always do, and their noise disturbed Apsu, who could not sleep. What happens next is a war, but not just any war. It is the war that creates the universe. Tiamat, enraged after the murder of her consort Apsu by the god Ea, unleashes everything she has. She fills the upper waters with monsters, creatures born from the same primordial stuff as the cosmos itself, given poison instead of blood, armed with weapons that cannot be touched by ordinary hands. She creates a great serpent with sharp teeth, a roaring dragon, a storm demon, a raging dog, a scorpion man, creatures of storm and creatures of chaos. She gives these beings to her new consort, Kingu, and she gives Kingu the Tablet of Destinies, the document that confers absolute authority over the universe, and she goes to war. Among all the gods, only one steps forward to face her. His name is Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, the son of Ea, and he is described as the tallest and mightiest of the gods, someone whose very appearance commands the storms. He agrees to fight Tiamat on one condition, that if he wins, he becomes king of the gods forever. The other gods agree. And what follows is not just a battle. It is the act of creation itself. Marduk faces Tiamat, and he does something that no weapon could do alone. He opens the great net that Anu had given him, and he drives the 4 winds into her open mouth so that she cannot close it, so that she swells with the force of the storm winds trapped inside her, and then he drives his spear through her distended belly. She is split in 2. And from those 2 halves, Marduk builds the world. This is the moment the tablets have been building toward, and it is the moment most people have never heard about in any real detail. Because what Marduk does with Tiamat's body is not poetic or symbolic in the way we might expect. It is architectural. He takes the upper half of her body, her back, her skin, and he lifts it overhead and stretches it across the sky. He draws a bolt across it. He sets guards at its edges to prevent the waters from escaping. He creates a ceiling, a literal physical ceiling of the sky, made from the body of the ocean goddess herself, and above that ceiling, trapped behind it, held back by the bolt Marduk placed there, are Tiamat's waters, the upper ocean, the ocean above the dome. This is confirmed by one of the most extraordinary fragments in all of Mesopotamian scholarship. It is known in academic circles as Fragment S 2013, a small piece of clay that survived long enough for scholars to read what it contains. On that fragment, the ancient scribes made a distinction that should stop anyone who encounters it cold. They wrote of a Tiamat Eziti and a Tiamat Shapliti, an upper Tiamat and a lower Tiamat, the waters above and the waters below. They are named separately. They are understood as distinct places, one above the dome of the sky and one beneath the foundations of the earth. The universe, in the Sumerian cosmological model, is surrounded. It is enclosed. It is a bubble inside an infinite ocean, held apart by nothing more than the dome Marduk built from a dead goddess's skin. Now, step back from that and think about what this means geographically and cosmologically. The Sumerians were not simply imagining that the sky was pretty or that the stars were lights hanging on a curtain. They had a complete three-dimensional model of the universe. At the bottom, below the earth, was Apsu, the freshwater deep, where the god Enki lived in his palace, surrounded by the wisdom of the waters. Above Apsu was the earth, solid ground, the place of human beings, the world of cities and fields and rivers that flowed up from the subterranean deep. Above the earth was the atmosphere, the space of wind and weather where the god Enlil moved, whose very name means Lord of Wind. And above the atmosphere was the firmament, the solid dome, the skin of Tiamat, stretched taut across the sky, bolted shut. And above that dome was the celestial ocean, and above the ocean were the gods. The divine realm was not in the sky we see. It was above the sky we see. The gods lived above the water that was above the sky. When the Sumerians built their great ziggurats, those stepped pyramids that rose from the plains of Mesopotamia and could be seen from miles away, they were not simply building temples. They were building bridges. They were creating a structure tall enough to approach the base of the dome, close enough to the gods above that a human being standing at the summit might feel for a moment that the distance between worlds was almost crossable. This understanding changes how we read one of the most important artifacts ever recovered from Mesopotamia. It sits today in the British Museum. It is a limestone tablet, roughly the size of a book, carved and inscribed with remarkable precision. It is known as the Tablet of Shamash, or the Sun God Tablet, created around 860 to 850 BCE during the reign of the Babylonian king Nabu-apla-iddina. The carved relief at its top shows the sun god Shamash seated on his throne inside his divine shrine, with the king and a priest and a goddess approaching him from the left. And the entire shrine, the throne of Shamash, the solar disk on its altar, the ropes held by attendant deities, is shown resting on something that the British Museum's own catalogue entry describes without ambiguity as the heavenly ocean. The throne of the sun god is floating on water, above the sky. This is not a metaphor that scholars have read into the image. The wavy lines beneath the shrine are the standard ancient Near Eastern artistic convention for water, the same convention used in hundreds of other images to represent rivers, seas, and floods. The shrine of the sun god is above the sky, resting on the celestial ocean, which is above the dome that covers the earth below. When the ancient Babylonians looked at this image, they understood immediately what they were seeing: the divine realm above the upper waters, above the firmament, unreachable by anything except prayer and ritual and the smoke rising from altars below. Above the sun, God's throne and the image are three symbols: a lunar crescent, a solar disk, and an eight-pointed star, representing Sin, the moon god, Shamash, the sun god, and Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. These three great celestial deities in the Mesopotamian cosmological model did not live in the sky we see. Their thrones were above the dome. They crossed the sky each day and night by passing through gates, doors in the firmament that opened at the eastern horizon and closed at the western, allowing the sun and moon and stars to travel through the lower atmosphere and then return above the dome by some hidden passage beneath the earth. The sun's nightly journey was a matter of serious theological debate in ancient Mesopotamia. If the sun went down in the west and came back up in the east, what path did it travel in the hours of darkness? Some texts argued that the sun traveled beneath the earth, through the underworld, passing through the domain of the dead before rising again. Others said that the sun simply never stopped moving, that it circled perpetually, dipping below the horizon of the flat earth, but continuing without pause. The question was not academic. It touched on the nature of the divine order itself, on whether the cosmos was reliable, on whether the gods could be trusted to maintain the machinery of time. What makes the Mesopotamian cosmological system so remarkable is not just that it existed, but that it was coherent. Every piece connected to every other piece. The upper ocean was the remnant of Tiamat. The firmament was her stretched skin. The gates in the east and west were the places where the dome touched the earth. The ziggurats were attempts to reach the underside of the dome from below. The rivers and springs were water rising up from Apsu, the subterranean deep. through channels and passages in the Earth's foundation. Rain was the upper ocean leaking through, or being deliberately released by the gods who controlled the bolts and gates of the firmament. This was a complete system. It explained everything the Sumerians and Babylonians could observe, and it explained it with a consistency that took centuries to develop and refine. The monsters Tiamat created before her death, the ones she filled with venom and sent against the younger gods, did not simply disappear after her defeat. Marduk captured them. He bound them and placed them at his feet as trophies. Some interpretations of the later tablets suggest that at least some of these creatures were transformed, elevated, turned into beings that served the new cosmic order rather than threatening it. The celestial ocean above the dome was not empty. It was a realm. It had inhabitants. The gods moved through it. The monsters born from Tiamat's body were part of its fabric. When ancient Mesopotamian astronomers looked at the sky and mapped the constellations, they were not just charting stars. They were mapping the underside of the dome, the reflections of a divine world above the water they could not see. The connection between the upper ocean and the creatures within it becomes even more vivid when you understand how the Sumerians thought about the nature of divine beings. The gods were not separate from the elements they represented. Tiamat was not just a goddess associated with water. She was the water. Her body was the ocean. Marduk split her in two. The upper half became the sky, not because he placed it there symbolically, but because the upper half of her body was, in substance, the ocean above the dome. The creatures she had birthed were therefore not simply living in the upper waters. They were, in some sense, made of the same stuff as those waters. They were extensions of the primordial ocean itself, given form and will and the terrifying capacity for violence. Among the creatures Tiamat created and armed, the ancient texts name several with a specificity that suggests these were not random inventions, but carefully considered beings, each representing something real about the chaotic forces of the natural world. There was the Mushusu, the fierce serpent depicted in Babylonian art as a scaled creature with the body of a serpent, the forelegs of a lion, the hind legs of a bird, and a head set with horns. This creature would later become the symbol of Marduk himself, a kind of cosmic trophy transformed into an emblem of divine authority. There was the Ugalu, the storm demon, a being of the upper air. There were creatures of scorpion and lion mixed together, beings that embodied the intersection between sky and earth, between the ordered world of the gods and the chaotic primordial depths from which all things had come. These creatures were depicted on the walls of Babylon's great Ishtar Gate, the entrance to the city built by Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century BCE. Dragon-like beings with scaly bodies and serpents' heads, their flickering tongues preserved in glazed tile for 25 centuries. The gate was not just a monument to royal power, it was a cosmological statement. These were the creatures of Tiamat's army, now bound in service to the gods of Babylon, marking the threshold between the human city and the divine order it mirrored. Every person who passed through that gate was walking between images of the beings that swam in the ocean above the dome. The connection between the Sumerian and Babylonian cosmological tradition and later religious texts is one of the most studied questions in the history of religion. And it is impossible to discuss the upper ocean without noting how it resonates through thousands of years of subsequent thought. The Hebrew word for the deep in Genesis, Tehom, is linguistically related to Tiamat. The waters above the firmament in Genesis 1:7 are the exact equivalent of the upper Tiamat in fragment S 2:13. The separation of waters above and below, the creation of a firmament to divide them, the calling of dry land from the lower waters, these are the same structural moves as in the Enuma Elish, rearranged and transformed, but recognizably connected to the same ancient understanding of the universe's architecture. This does not make one tradition derivative of the other in any simple sense. It means that there was a shared cosmological understanding across the ancient Near East, a picture of the world that made sense to the people who lived there, that matched their experience of heavy skies and underground springs in the ocean that pressed against every coastline. The dome above was real to them, not as a theological abstraction, but as a physical fact, as certain as the horizon and as inevitable as the sunrise. The water above the dome was not something they questioned. It was something they managed. Through ritual, through prayer, through the maintenance of temples and the appeasement of gods who controlled the bolts and gates of the celestial ocean. Rain in the system was an act of divine will. When the gods opened the windows of heaven, a phrase that appears in ancient texts from Mesopotamia and echoes forward into the Hebrew Bible, water fell through the firmament from the upper ocean above. Flood was the catastrophic failure of those gates, the upper ocean breaking through in torrents too great to be controlled. The great flood myths of Mesopotamia, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the Atrahasis, epic, texts older than anything in the Hebrew Bible, describe exactly this: the decision by the gods to open the celestial waters and let the upper ocean pour down on the world below. In the Atrahasis epic, the flood is the deliberate choice of the gods, who have grown weary of the noise and multiplication of humanity. Enlil, the lord of wind and weather, pushes to destroy human beings. The upper ocean is the weapon. The dome becomes a sluice gate. It is worth dwelling on what that means cosmologically. The ocean above the dome was not passive, it was not simply decorative, it was the ultimate threat and the ultimate resource, the reservoir of divine power that could end all life below if the gods chose to release it. Every storm was a reminder that the dome was not perfectly sealed. Every flood was a demonstration that the boundary between the human world and the upper ocean was real and was, at least in principle, permeable. The ancient Mesopotamians lived with an awareness of the ceiling above them that modern people have entirely lost, and that awareness shaped their religion, their architecture, their astronomy, and their understanding of who they were in relation to the cosmos. The ziggurats were not only bridges to the divine, they were also, symbolically, the highest point of refuge in a world that could at any moment be covered by the descending waters of the upper ocean. The great temples at their summits were places where the gods could descend from above, where the distance between the celestial ocean and the human world was at its smallest. Priests who climbed to those summits were doing something cosmologically significant. They were approaching the underside of the dome, putting themselves as close as possible to the world above the water, making themselves available to beings whose feet rested in the celestial sea. What swims in the ocean above the dome is a question the ancient tablets answer in scattered fragments. Some of the beings above the firmament are gods. Some are the monsters born from Tiamat, transformed and bound. Some are the celestial forms of constellations that the Babylonian astronomers mapped with extraordinary precision over centuries of observation. The Babylonians were among the most sophisticated astronomers in the ancient world. Their records of planetary movements, eclipses, and stellar cycles were so accurate that modern astronomers still use Babylonian data. What they were watching, in their own understanding, was not the movement of distant physical objects through empty space. They were watching divine beings move through the divine realm above the dome, their reflections or their traces visible through the celestial sea above as light visible through water. This is the picture the tablets give us when we put all the pieces together. A universe of layers, each inhabited, each governed by specific divine authorities, each connected to the others by gates and passages and the controlled flow of the primal waters. Below everything, Apsu, the freshwater deep, where Enki sat in his palace of wisdom. Then the earth, a flat disk surrounded by the ocean of Tiamat's lower remnant. Then the atmosphere, the realm of weather and wind, of Enlil and his storms. Then the firmament as the dome, the bolted ceiling, the stretched skin of the dead primordial goddess. Then the upper ocean, the waters above, the remnant of Tiamat's upper half, the celestial sea. And above the sea, the divine realm where the gods lived, where the sun god Shamash sat on his floating throne, where Sin moved with the crescent moon and Ishtar blazed like the eight-pointed star. Between the human world and that divine realm were exactly two things, the dome and the water above it. Everything the ancient Mesopotamians did in their religious lives was, in some sense, an attempt to reach across that gap, to call the gods down through the water and through the dome, to make them present in the human world below. These tablets are not curiosities. They are not the confused guesswork of people who did not know better. They are the product of a civilization that lasted longer than any other civilization in human history, that built the world's first cities, invented writing, developed mathematics and astronomy and law and literature, and looked at the sky with the same intensity we bring to it today. They had different answers than we have. Whether their answers were wrong in the way we assume is a question worth sitting with, because what they observed was real. The sky does press down, the horizon does curve, water does fall from above. The sun does move from east to west and somehow return. The universe does seem to have a structure, a boundary, a set of laws that govern it with unfailing consistency. They called the structure a dome. They called the water above it Tiamat. They called the beings who moved through it gods. And they wrote it all down on clay, pressed into the earth of Mesopotamia, where it waited in the dark for 5,000 years until we dug it up and began, slowly and incompletely, to read what it said. The ocean above the dome is still there in the text. As clear and as strange as it was, the day a Babylonian scribe pressed it into wet clay by lamplight in a city that no longer exists, in a world that understood the sky to be a ceiling, and the ceiling to be a locked door, and beyond that locked door, more water than the human mind could hold. That is what the tablets say, and we have only just begun to read them.